So in about a month, we're going to start our year-long course, The Poetics of Enchantment. And one of the things we're going to be exploring in this year-long course is how literature imagines other worlds. Worlds, sometimes spiritual realities of other dimensions that overlay with our own. We're going to be looking at how medieval writers and even some very recent writers have thought about this concept of the other world. And one of the most creative writers to imagine and engage with the other world is George MacDonald. And today, on the publication of this video, is his 200th birthday. MacDonald was a Scottish poet and a novelist. He rose to fame during the time of Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. He knew Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland. He was a correspondent and friend to the critic John Ruskin. Lady Byron, the poet's wife, was a friend of his and supported his work, really believed in the sort of art that MacDonald was producing. And during his lecture tour to America, he met Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, many other American writers. And MacDonald was read by Mark Twain and Twain's wife, Olivia Langdon, actually. And he was really, really popular in the 19th century. Today, he's only read by a few, and he's often acknowledged, usually within the context of the Oxford Inklings. J.R.R. Tolkien read MacDonald and mentions him in one of his essays. C.S. Lewis called him his spiritual master. C.S. Lewis actually said that he never wrote a book without quoting George MacDonald. Other fantasy writers, such as Madeleine L'Engle and others, have acknowledged debts to him. Another important person who read MacDonald was G.K. Chesterton. So whenever MacDonald is mentioned today, he's usually figured as this precursor to the Inklings or to fantasy literature, as if he were an origin of that great tradition of fantasy literature. And in some ways, he really is. But rather than presenting MacDonald as a wellspring, I want to show you how he might also be seen as a high point in a very long tradition of visionary writers. So we're going to cover his novel Phantastes in the spring, 2025, in the course. And there's more information on that course in the description below. But for now, I want to introduce some major themes that are going to prepare us for the readings we'll be doing in this course, and to introduce the major concept of the other world, which is pretty much the strangest and most charming aspect of, I think, his art, is what he calls the fairyland, which is the other world in his novels. So George MacDonald's conception of fairyland is really a reworking of what the Roman poet Lucanus called the orbis alius, the foreign or alien world. And he was describing the Celtic tradition of the other world when he coined that term. So it's this other world, this idea of another world kind of coexisting with our own. And the heroes and heroines of MacDonald's stories often co-inhabit two worlds, sometimes more than two, and we might call it another universe or another dimension. In his novels, fairyland is often considered as a landscape in which the spiritual topography is mapped onto this literal landscape. And we've seen this in allegories before. In fact, once you cross the borders, the divisions between literal and figurative become obsolete, as do most dualisms once you get into this other world, whether it's the mind and body dualism, masculine-feminine dualism, psychology and narration, inner and outer, spirit and matter, earth, afterlife, those kinds of binaries don't really work in fairyland. It's really interesting that everything kind of blends in a harmonious way. So let me give you an idea of how the other world works in MacDonald. Here is Phantastes. This is the frontispiece, which is really nice, illustrated by John Bell. And then up above, there is a famous illustration from Arthur Hughes, one of the pre-Raphaelites of MacDonald's time. This is a really interesting and strange, kind of mysterious book. Here's another Arthur Hughes illustration. This is the opening of Phantastes. And let me read you the opening of this book, because this is how he gets into fairyland, the protagonist, Anados. He says, I suddenly, as one awakes to the consciousness that the sea has been moaning by him for hours, or that the storm has been howling about his window all night, became aware of the sound of running water near me, and looking out of bed, I saw that a large green marble basin, in which I was wont to wash, and which stood on a low pedestal of the same material in a corner of my room, was overflowing like a spring. The tree under which I seemed to have lain all night was one of the advanced guard of a dense forest, towards which the rivulet ran, faint traces of a footpath, much overgrown with grass and moss, and with here and there, a pimpernel even, were discernible along the right bank. This, I thought, must surely be the path to fairyland. I crossed the rivulet and accompanied it, keeping the footpath on its right bank until it led me, as I expected, into the wood. Here I left it without any good reason, and with a vague feeling that I ought to have followed its course, I took a more southerly direction. And this crossing through the water, through the rivulet, is really significant because it's part of the baptism imagery that MacDonald often uses. Okay, so this whole story is within the quest narrative tradition, much like the Arthurian tales of Chrétien de Troyes or Sir Thomas Malory. Anados enters this symbolic world. It's not purely symbolic. It's not allegorical, I should say, but it is symbolic. He encounters various symbolic figures over the course of his journeying. And like the figures in Spenser's The Fairy Queen, he meets a series of tests. But what's going on in this passage, it's this reinvention of the Otherworld tradition from the medieval and Renaissance writers. Like Malory, like Spenser, but actually going back even further in time. It operates according to its own laws, this world, and much like Spenser's Fairyland. In fact, there's even this allegorical quality to the name of Anados here, which in the Greek means without a path. So he's somebody without a path. But where Spenser's Fairyland is political and philosophical, and in some ways religious, MacDonald's is spiritual and psychological. It actually yields really nicely to a Jungian interpretation. I mean, you even have the shadow that comes out and follows him. And it's just very fascinating. There's many ways you can read it, and I think it works really well as a psychological allegory. MacDonald's worlds, though, blend this medieval mysticism and narrative style, this Spenserian narration of the allegory, with very contemporary romantic aesthetics, and also German idealism. So he's actually doing something new and pushing this tradition further in interesting ways. The nature of MacDonald's Fairyland is established upon the principle that the mind is a microcosm of the world, and this goes back to some of the German romantics that he was reading. Friedrich Schlegel, Friedrich von Hardenberg, also called Novalis. As above, so below. As within, so without. So the allegorical form only goes so far, which is interesting because it's a literary representation of a larger metaphysics of nature. And the night before he awakens into fairyland, Anados encounters a figure who calls herself his grandmother, and she says something really interesting about this world, the fairy world. She says to him, "Your little sister was reading a fairy tale to you last night." Anados says she was. When she had finished, she said as she closed the book, she said, "Is there a fairy country, brother?" You replied with a sigh, "I suppose there is, if one could find the way into it." I did, but I meant something quite different from what you seem to think. Never mind what I seem to think. You shall find the way into fairyland tomorrow. Now look into my eyes. Eagerly I did so. They filled me with an unknown longing. I remembered somehow that my mother died when I was a baby. I looked deeper and deeper till they spread around me like seas, and I sank in their waters. I forgot all the rest, till I found myself at the window, whose gloomy curtains were withdrawn, and where I stood gazing on a whole heaven of stars. small and sparkling in the moonlight. Below lay a sea, still as death and hoary in the moon, sweeping into bays and around capes and islands, away, away, I knew not whither. Alas, it was no sea, but a low bog burnished by the moon. Surely there is such a sea somewhere, said I to myself. A low, sweet voice beside me replied, In fairyland, Anados. Okay, so in some respects, fairyland is emblematic of this lost paradise, perhaps of Eden. But really, it's something more than that. It's also the land of the ideal. And this is where Plato, I think, will help, and the German idealists, in fact. It's in this ideal wherein resides the object of spiritual desire, but it is also a land of peril and danger. So let's go further back than Spencer, into the Celtic otherworlds of the medieval period, and examine some of the symbols here. So a recent critic, Alfred K. Siewers, in his chapter Orthodoxy and Ecopoetics, Siewers traces the roots of the Otherworld tradition even further to Irish mythology, which focuses on a network, what he calls these specific places in the land that are portals to the otherworld. Now, Siewers also observes that the Celtic otherworlds theologically influenced and were entertained by the Irish theologian of the 9th century, Johannes Scotus Erigena, whose work we will be reading in this course. So of Erigena's philosophy of nature, Siewers writes that in Erigena's philosophy of nature, physical creation is a continuum from primordial causes that he described as divine to theophanies and their physical effects. The result is a physical world sparkling with divine energies or meaning, in which dialectic metonym and hermeneutics iconographically become incarnational processes. So the other worlds of medieval literature are not strictly set apart from the world we inhabit, as the name might suggest, an other world. But their representations imply that the world which we do inhabit is, in some respects, porous, that we can sometimes see into the other world. There are places where the veil is thin. So in Phantastes, MacDonald writes, As through the hard rock go the branching silver veins, as into the solid land run the creeks and gulfs from the unresting sea, as the lights and influences of the upper worlds sink silently through the earth's atmosphere, so doth fairy invade the world of men, and sometimes startle the common eye with associations as of cause and effect, when between the two no connecting links can be traced. So although this idea, of fairies, it was really popular in Victorian literature, and I think that popularity might actually lead us astray when it comes to MacDonald. Even though this otherworld in Victorian literature is there, it's mostly the medievalist scholars who are talking about it. Howard Patch, 1950, he has this study which considered this as a motif. Aisling Byrne, more recently, has written a book on the other world, and she says that in medieval literature, the other world is a broad concept that includes the next world, the world of fairies, an imaginary fantastical realm, or less frequently, far-flung corners of the globe, such as the wondrous East or Antipodes. Now, what I think is often missed about MacDonald is the degree of sophistication with which he engages with this tradition. People hear fairyland and they think, oh, Disney cartoons, and they completely miss the philosophical depth of this concept at play. The Otherworld tradition was very much alive in native Irish and Scottish traditions, and MacDonald grew up in Aberdeen, Scotland, where the supernatural lore and traditions were actually very much a part of life. It's very much alive. The theological and philosophical depth of his reimagining of these traditions, I think, is a little bit understudied. The fairyland in Phantastes is a place to move into and out of. I think this is an important point. It's not necessarily the ideal into which we must go and stay. It's actually this allegorical, symbolic world of transformation. So Anidos eventually does return to his ordinary world. He enters by crossing the stream out of his room and into the woods, has all of these transformative encounters, and then comes back. And this is from the last chapter, how he describes it. There's no spoilers here, other than the fact that he does make it back. On the morning of my disappearance, they had found the floor of my room flooded, and all that day a wondrous and nearly impervious mist had hung about the castle and grounds. I had been gone, they told me, 21 days. To me it seemed 21 years. Nor could I yet feel secure in my new experiences. When, at night, I lay down once more in my own bed, I did not feel at all sure that when I awoke, I should not find myself in some mysterious region of fairyland. My dreams were incessant and perturbed, but when I did awake, I saw clearly that I was in my own home. Heroes are meant to pass, or heroines as well, are meant to pass into the other world, but not remain there, and this is true for most literary representations of this. In his 1957 Anatomy of Criticism, Northrop Frye, literary critic, traces the genre of what he calls the green world in comedy, especially Renaissance comedy. We'll encounter it when we read The Winter's Tale in this course, but here's a little foretaste of it. Now remember that comedies are not supposed to just make us laugh. They actually are stories that tend to have a happy resolution as opposed to tragedy. So that's what he means when he says comedy here. Thus, the action of the comedy begins in a world represented as a normal world, moves into the green world, goes into a metamorphosis there in which the comic resolution is achieved, and returns to the normal world. This is how it works in literature, saying the forest is the embryonic form of the fairy world of Midsummer Night's Dream, the forest of Arden in As You Like It, Windsor Forest in The Merry Wives, and the pastoral world of the mythical sea-coasted Bohemia in The Winter's Tale. In all these comedies, there is the same rhythmic movement from the normal world to the green world and back again. And you might be thinking, too, of Joseph Campbell's whole journey of the hero. He goes out, he comes back. This is participating in that rhythm. And the drama of the green world employs the theme of triumph of life over the wasteland, as Northrop Frye mentions. It's also interesting to think about T.S. Eliot's Wasteland in this way. It's this death and revival of the year that's dramatized by the narrative action, which are still human, yet also strangely divine as well. So if we go back at this passage towards the end of the book, the passage goes on. We're going to start right here. My mind soon grew calm, and I began the duties of my new position somewhat instructed, I hope, by the adventures that had befallen me in fairyland. Could I translate the experience of my travels there into common life? This was the question. Or must I live it all over again and learn it all over again in the other forms that belong to the world of men, whose experience yet runs parallel to that of fairyland? These questions I cannot answer yet, but I fear. So it's interesting to think of the allegorical parallel, the figurative or hermeneutics of reading an allegory requires one to hold in tension two narratives, one literal, one figurative, but potentially many of them. But what's interesting here about this final paragraph is that I think anyone who has experienced some kind of mystical experience will understand this feeling, the sort of blank recession of spirit caused by the abrupt contrast between the ordinary world and the spiritual reality, however briefly experienced. But the reality, the spiritual reality, or the otherworld encounter, will suddenly seem more real than the ordinary world which they now inhabit. So people who have undergone these experiences understand how the otherworld is an adequate yet insufficient metaphor by which to represent the encounter. These people are often left with a sense of waiting and suspension, as though at any time, any moment, the spell of the mundane might be disenchanted, and they might suddenly find themselves back on the border of this experience. They often move through life as outsiders, sometimes figures on the margins, ever in a patient suspense, confident that they will one day return, or hope that they might, but usually somehow patiently satisfied to continue with the work that has been entrusted to them, whatever that is. Here it's clearly the duties of his new position. He's a 21-year-old who now has administrative duties. And that's what many of the visionary writers attempt to do, to press against the lie of appearances, the appearances that are constantly saying things like buy, or work, or consume, be entertained. There's a greater reality about us, and that's what the visionary tradition is always trying to put forward. And the assurance of this is, I think, really the achievement of George MacDonald's literature, one of the great things that his literature gives us. So George MacDonald is somebody who I think should be read today. I'll leave you with this quotation from G.K. Chesterton, which I think is great. He was writing this, or he delivered this speech in 1901. As I have said, Dr. MacDonald will not be discovered for some time to come. There are men and movements which the moment they have passed are at their very furthest from us, like some point of a wheel when it has just touched the ground. We live now among the poets who cannot conceive of the universal power containing any larger feelings than their own. They cannot imagine, in the tremendous words of Dante, the love that drives the sun and all the stars, for the loves of which they write would not drive thistledown. But the great thought which Dr. MacDonald utters and leaves unuttered alike in a kind of fatalistic optimism will never wholly cease to haunt and attack us. At 100-odd moments, in corked streets and twilight fields, in lamp-lit drawing rooms, there will come upon us the confounding and yet comforting notion that we and all our nationalistic philosophies are all in the heart of a fairy tale and playing an uncommonly silly part in it. So, if you'd like to learn more about MacDonald, there are some resources in the description below. And I think this also will serve as a good primer to the Otherworld tradition we'll be exploring in the Poetics of Enchantment in just a month. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.